Look, I'm not the kind of guy who goes looking for trouble. In fact, I've spent the better part of my adult life in places where trouble is the only thing on the menu. So when I finally hung up the uniform and bought that place out in Shadow Creek, all I wanted was a porch, a grill, and the kind of silence that doesn't make your ears ring. But apparently, that was asking too much from a woman named Beatrice Vance. I remember the day I moved in. The sun was hitting the pavement just right, and I was unloading my old truck when I saw her, standing there with a clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon, watching me with these narrow, judgmental eyes that seemed to be measuring the exact shade of my t-shirt against some invisible standard of, and quote, neighborhood purity, and quote. She didn't say hello. She didn't offer a welcome basket. She just stared, and in that moment, I knew that my quiet retirement was about to become a battlefield, though I didn't realize just how literal that battlefield was going to get. You see, Beatrice was the queen bee of the Shadow Creek HOA, a woman who lived for the thrill of a lawn that was exactly 2.5 inches tall and the intoxicating power of a finely worded, and quote, notice of violation, and quote. But there was one tiny, glaring detail that she just couldn't wrap her head around. My house wasn't an oppos, T in her jurisdiction. Back in the late 90s, the original developer had a falling out with the county, and a handful of lots on the edge of the woods, including mine, were carved out of the association's boundaries, leaving us as this little island of freedom in a sea of beige siding and enforced conformity. I tried to tell her that, I really did, the first time she waddled onto my driveway to complain about the, end quote, industrial aesthetic, end quote. On my vintage Bronco, I pulled out the county survey and showed her the red line that clearly separated my property from her little kingdom. I was polite. I was calm. I even offered her a bottle of water because she looked like she was about to overheat from pure indignation. But she just looked at that map like it was a personal insult, her lip curling as she told me that, and quote, community spirit doesn't in oppos. T care about red lines, and quote, and that I'd be, in quote, hearing from her office, and quote, very soon. For the next 6 months, it was a slow burn war of attrition, with Beatrice sending me letters for things that didn't in oppos to even exist, like, in quote, improper shadow placement, in quote, from my oak tree, or the, in quote, aggressive tone, in quote, on my mailbox. And honestly, I just ignored it because when you've dealt with real threats, a middle-aged woman with a label maker just feels like a hobbyist. But Beatrice didn't and oppos. T like being ignored. She was used to neighbors who would crumble and apologize the moment she cleared her throat, and my silence was like pouring gasoline on her ego until she decided that if she couldn't and oppos T control me through paperwork, she'd control me through fear. I started seeing these two guys hanging around the neighborhood, driving a blacked-out SUV with, and quote, community safety, and quote, decals that look like they've been printed at a local Kinko's, and they just sit at the end of my driveway, staring at my house for hours, trying to look like the Secret Service when they actually looked like guys who'd been kicked out of mall security for being too intense. Then came that Tuesday, a day that started out perfectly normal. I was in my garage, working on an old motorcycle, the smell of grease and oil providing that familiar comfort, when I heard the crunch of gravel and the heavy thud of boots on my driveway. I walked out, wiping my hands on a rag, and there they were, the, in quote, safety boys, in quote, standing there in these stiff, tactical vests that were clearly too small for them, their shoulders squared as if they were expecting a camera crew to start filming an action movie. One was tall and wiry with a goatee that screamed, in quote, I watched too many YouTube survivalists, in quote, and the other was a shorter, blockier guy who looked like he'd spent his entire life being told he was special, and both of them were resting their hands on these oversized, serrated knives clipped to their belts. They didn't in oppos. T asked who I was. They didn't in oppos. T present any real ID. They just barked at me that I was in, end quote, major breach of community safety protocols, end quote, and that I needed to step out into the street so they could, end quote, escort me to a secondary location for processing, end quote, which is a fancy way of saying they wanted to kidnap me in broad daylight. I just stood there, leaning against the frame of my garage, and I actually laughed, which I think was the moment things shifted from a misunderstanding to a disaster, because men like that cannot handle being laughed at. End quote. Look, fellas, end quote, I said, my voice low and steady, the kind of tone I used to use when I was trying to de-escalate a nervous rookie, end quote. I don an oppos. T know what Beatrice told you, or how much she's paying you to play act like this, but you and Oppos, re-standing on private property that doesn't and Oppos. T belong to your little club, so I'm going to give you exactly 10 seconds to turn around, get back in your little SUV, and go find a cat to rescue from a tree. End quote. The shorter guy, the blocky. One, his face turned a shade of purple. I didn't into Oppos. T think was biologically possible, and he reached down, unsheathing that knife with a slow, dramatic hiss of steel that was supposed to make my heart race. But all it did was flip a switch in the back of my brain that I hadn't into Oppos. T used in years. End quote. You think this is a joke? End quote. He hissed, stepping forward, the blade angled up toward my chest. End quote. You think you're above the rules? Beatrice said you were a problem, and we're the solution. Now, put your hands behind your head, or we're going to have to do this the hard way. End quote. I didn't in Oppos. T move an inch. I just watched the way his weight shifted, the way his partner was trying to circle around to my left, trying to use a flanking maneuver they probably learned from a video game, and I felt this strange, cold clarity wash over me. It wasn't Oppos. T anger, it was just data. I saw the opening in his stance, the lack of tension in his wrist, the way he was breathing too fast, and I knew that in about 3 seconds, my quiet Tuesday was going to end in a lot of paperwork and even more blood. End quote. Last warning, end quote. I whispered, and I saw the tall one lunge, his knife sweeping out in a wide, amateurish arc that left his entire side exposed, and it was like time just slowed down to a crawl. I didn't in Oppos. T stepped back. I stepped into him, catching his forearm with the hard bone of my elbow and driving it down with enough force to make his teeth rattle. And as he let out this surprised little grunt, I didn't in Oppos. T stop. I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the muscle memory taking over as I slammed my shoulder into his chest, sending him reeling back toward the garage wall, and before his partner could even process what was happening, I was already moving toward him. The blocky guy panicked. He started swinging that blade like he was trying to kill a swarm of bees, and I just waited for the rhythm, waited for the moment his arm extended too far, and then I grabbed his wrist and twisted it with everything I had. The sound of his bone popping was loud in the quiet afternoon air, followed by a scream that sounded more like a wounded animal than end quote. Tough guy, end quote. And as the knife clattered to the concrete, I didn't in Oppos. T let up. I couldn't in Oppos. I delivered 3 quick, surgical strikes to his midsection, feeling his ribs give way under my knuckles, and then I swept his legs, watching him hit the pavement with a heavy, final thud that seemed to echo through the whole neighborhood. The tall one was trying to get back up, his face covered in dust and blood. Reaching for the knife, I'd knocked away, so I just stepped over, picked it up myself, and held it right under his chin, my breathing barely even elevated while he looked up at me with eyes that finally understood who he was dealing with. The neighborhood wasn't in Oppos, T quiet anymore. I could hear doors opening, people shouting, the frantic sound of Beatrice's voice somewhere in the distance screaming about, end quote, assault, end quote, and end quote, calling the real police, end quote. And I just stood there in the center of my driveway, holding 2 knives and watching the red light on my security camera blink like a tiny, watchful eye. I stayed exactly like that until the sirens started wailing, until the blue and red lights started dancing against the trees, and when the first cruiser pulled up and the officers jumped out with their weapons drawn, I didn't in Oppos. T argue I didn't in Oppos. T run, I just dropped the knives and put my hands up, letting the cool metal of the handcuffs click around my wrists. They took me to the station, but they also took the footage from my garage, and they took the statement from the 3 neighbors who had been watching the whole thing from behind their curtains, and most importantly, they took a look at my service record. When the lead detective walked into the interrogation room, he wasn't in Oppos. T carrying a heavy folder of charges, he was carrying 2 cups of coffee and a look of pure, unadulterated disbelief as he told me that they'd just finished raiding Beatrice's house. It turns out Beatrice hadn't an Oppos. T just hired those guys to scare me. She'd been using HOA funds to pay them under the table for months, running a literal protection racket against anyone who didn't end Oppos. T vote her way, and those, in quote, safety boys, in quote, were actually 2 ex-cons she'd met through end quote, neighborhood watch, in quote, forum who were more than happy to play soldier for a few $100 a week. The fallout was like a beautiful, slow-motion explosion. The blocky guy ended up with a permanent limp and a 32-year sentence for about a dozen different felonies. And his partner didn't in oppos. T fare much better, but the real crown jewel was Beatrice Vance. Seeing her being led out of her pristine, white picket fence home in handcuffs, her face streaked with mascara and her, end quote, community spirit, end quote, completely shattered, was a sight I'll cherish until the day I die, especially when the judge handed her 15 years for conspiracy and solicitation of a violent crime. The Shadow Creek HOA didn't and oppos. T survived the week. The remaining members were so terrified of being sued into the Stone Age that they dissolved the whole thing, leaving the neighborhood to actually, just be a neighborhood. Now, things are finally quiet again, the way they were supposed to be, and I still sit on my porch every evening, watching the sun go down and the Broncos sitting in the driveway. But every once in a while, a new neighbor will walk by and look at my house with a bit of curiosity. They see a guy who keeps his lawn, end quote, good enough, end quote, a guy who doesn't in oppos, to go to meetings, and a guy who has a very high-quality security camera system, and they usually just nod and keep walking because the story of what happened on that Tuesday has become a bit of a local legend. They say I'm a hero, or they say I'm a monster, or they say I'm just a guy who wanted to be left alone, but I'm curious what you think. Was I right to take it as far as I did? Or is there a point where self-defense becomes something else? Does a person have the right to meet fake authority with real force? Or should I have just stayed inside and called the cops while they stood on my land? Let me know in the comments, because honestly, I've had a lot of time to think about it, and I still don't know if there's a, end quote, right, end quote, way to handle a woman like Beatrice, but I do know one thing. Nobody's touched my Bronco in years.